The December wind cut through Evangeline's worn wool coat like a blade, carrying with it the bitter promise of a Colorado winter that cared nothing for her circumstances or her destination. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and pressed herself closer to the weathered wall of the Menard train station, watching her breath form small clouds that disappeared as quickly as her hopes seemed to be doing. The train that was supposed to carry her to Denver had broken down 20 miles east, and the station master, a thin, sour-faced man who had looked at her with barely concealed disdain, had informed her with obvious satisfaction that the next train wouldn't arrive for 3 days. 3 days. Evangeline closed her eyes and tried to calculate how much of her carefully hoarded money would stretch to cover food and lodging for 3 unexpected days, assuming she could even find someone willing to provide either to a woman of her complexion traveling alone. The arithmetic was not encouraging. She had left St. Louis with exactly enough funds to reach her destination and sustain herself for perhaps 2 weeks while she sought employment. This delay threatened to unravel the entire careful plan she had constructed over months of saving every penny from her work as a seamstress. The station platform was nearly deserted now, most of the other stranded passengers having found accommodation in town or made alternative arrangements. Evangeline had tried the boarding house first, only to be turned away with a curt explanation that they were full up. She had tried the hotel next, receiving an even colder reception, and finally the tavern, where the proprietor had looked at her as if she were something unpleasant he had discovered on his boot. Each rejection had been delivered with a particular brand of civility that made the underlying hostility all the more cutting. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to encourage circulation in her feet, which had grown numb inside her practical but thin-soled boots. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now, the approaching darkness filled her with a growing dread. Where would she spend the night? The station waiting room closed at 9 o'clock, according to the sign posted by the door, and she doubted very much that any Christian charity would extend to keeping it open for her benefit. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention toward the main road. A magnificent black stallion was cantering toward the station, its rider sitting with the easy confidence of a man born to the saddle. Even in the gathering twilight, Evangeline could see that both horse and rider spoke of quality. The animal's coat gleamed with health and careful grooming, while the man's attire, though practical, was cut from fine materials and fitted with a precision that came only from skilled tailoring and considerable expense. As they drew closer, she found herself studying the rider with the particular attention one pays to any potential source of either help or trouble. He was tall, even-seated, with broad shoulders that filled his dark wool coat admirably. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his features, but she caught a glimpse of a strong jawline and what appeared to be light-colored hair. There was something about his bearing that suggested not just wealth but authority, the way he sat his horse as if he owned not just the animal but the very ground it trod upon. The stranger guided his mount to a halt near the station platform and dismounted with fluid grace. As he secured his reins to the hitching post, Evangeline found herself hoping he might be another stranded traveler, someone who might share information about alternative transportation or lodging. Any hope of assistance died quickly, however, when he turned toward the station building and she saw his face clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with features that spoke of good breeding and fortunate genetics. His hair was indeed light, a rich golden brown that caught what remained of the daylight, and his eyes were a startling blue-green that seemed to take in everything around him with sharp intelligence. But it was not his undeniable handsomeness that caused Evangeline's heart to sink. It was the unmistakable stamp of wealth and social position that marked him as clearly as a brand. This was a man accustomed to having doors opened for him, to being welcomed and catered to wherever he went. He would not understand her predicament, and even if he did, he would be far more likely to consider it a regrettable but inevitable consequence of her presumption in traveling alone. To her surprise, however, instead of walking past her into the station building, he paused and tipped his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "Good evening, miss. Are you waiting for the Denver train as well?" His voice was cultured, with a faint accent of education and refinement, but there was warmth in it that she had not expected. Evangeline straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly, drawing upon the dignity that no amount of hardship had been able to take from her. "I was, sir, but I understand it has been delayed until Thursday. Yes, I heard about the mechanical troubles. He glanced around the nearly empty platform and then back at her. Have you found accommodation in town? The question was asked with what seemed like genuine concern, but Evangeline hesitated before answering. Experience had taught her to be wary of white men who showed too much interest in her circumstances, particularly when those circumstances left her vulnerable. Yet there was something in his manner that suggested his inquiry was motivated by courtesy rather than any less honorable intention. I am still making arrangements, she said carefully, which was true enough if one considered standing on a train platform in the gathering cold to be a form of arrangement-making. He studied her face for a moment, and she had the unsettling sense that he was seeing more than she intended to reveal. Forgive me if I speak plainly, miss, but I suspect those arrangements are proving more difficult than anticipated. Am I correct? The directness of the question surprised her into honesty. You are not incorrect, sir. I thought as much. He was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider something. When he spoke again, his tone was businesslike but not unkind. My name is Alexander Whitmore. I own the W Ranch about 15 miles south of here. I have business in town this evening, but I will be returning home afterward. If you would accept the hospitality of my family's ranch until Thursday, you would be most welcome. Evangeline stared at him, certain she had misheard. I beg your pardon. I am offering you accommodation at my ranch until the train arrives. My aunt serves as my housekeeper and chaperone for my sister, so propriety would be observed. You would have a warm room, proper meals, and transportation back to the station on Thursday morning. The offer was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had experienced since leaving the familiarity of St. Louis, that for a moment she could only gape at him. When she found her voice, it came out smaller than she intended. That is very kind, Mr. Whitmore, but I could not possibly impose upon your family in such a manner. It would be no imposition. We have more than adequate space, and my aunt enjoys having guests. She would, I believe, appreciate the company of another lady. Evangeline's mind raced, trying to understand his motivation. Was this genuine Christian charity? Some sort of elaborate jest? Or something more sinister dressed up in the language of hospitality? She studied his face, looking for any sign of the predatory calculation she had learned to recognize, but found only what appeared to be sincere concern and growing impatience with her hesitation. I appreciate your kindness, sir, but I wonder if you have fully considered. That is, I should perhaps mention that I am not. She struggled to find a delicate way to point out what should have been obvious to him. You are concerned about your reception at my ranch because you are a woman of color traveling alone, he said bluntly, apparently having no difficulty with directness where she was struggling with delicacy. Let me put your mind at ease on that score. My family does not judge a person's worth by the accident of their birth, and anyone who would leave a fellow human being to freeze on a train platform because of such considerations would hardly deserve the name of Christian. The matter-of-fact way he addressed what she had been unable to say aloud left her momentarily speechless. In her experience, white people of his obvious social standing preferred to pretend that such distinctions did not exist, or when forced to acknowledge them, did so with obvious discomfort. His forthright acknowledgment was both refreshing and somehow more alarming than the usual evasions. Furthermore, he continued, if you are concerned about the expense, let me assure you that the cost of feeding one additional person for 3 days will not materially impact my family's finances. We are, I am happy to say, comfortably situated. This last comment was delivered with a sort of casual confidence that only comes from never having had to worry about money, and despite her gratitude for his offer, Evangeline felt a familiar pang of resentment at the ease with which he could solve her problems with a simple invitation. Still, her practical nature was already calculating the advantages of his proposal against the very real dangers of her current situation. I would insist on working for my accommodation, she said finally. I am skilled with a needle and experienced in household management. Surely there is some way I might make myself useful. He looked as if he might argue the point, then seemed to think better of it. If it would make you more comfortable to contribute to the household, I am certain my aunt could find suitable tasks. She is always complaining about the mending that accumulates faster than she can address it. A gust of wind chose that moment to remind Evangeline forcefully of her circumstances, cutting through her inadequate clothing and making her shiver despite her efforts to appear unaffected. The practical decision made itself. "Then I accept your kind offer, Mr. Whitmore, with gratitude." "Excellent." He seemed genuinely pleased by her acceptance. "I have business that will occupy me for perhaps 2 hours. If you would prefer to wait inside the station until I return, I will understand. But if you are not averse to accompanying me into town, I could introduce you to Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife. I believe you would find her company agreeable, and she could provide a hot meal while we conclude our business." The consideration implicit in his suggestion, that she might prefer the company of another woman, that she might be hungry, that she might be uncomfortable waiting alone, touched her more than perhaps it should have. It had been so long since anyone had thought to consider her comfort or preferences that she had almost forgotten what such courtesy felt like. "I would be grateful for the introduction, sir." "Then let us be on our way. I am afraid you will have to ride behind me, as I did not anticipate the need for additional transportation, but thunder here is quite steady and should cause you no difficulty." He moved to assist her in mounting, offering his hand with the same casual courtesy he might have shown to any lady. Evangeline hesitated for just a moment, the intimacy of sharing a horse with a strange man, the impropriety of the entire situation, then placed her hand in his and allowed him to help her up behind him. The horse was indeed steady, but the sensation of being seated so close to Alexander Whitmore was anything but steadying. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body through his coat, could catch the faint scent of good soap and leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her acutely aware of how long it had been since she had been this close to any man, let alone one who had shown her such unexpected kindness. As they rode toward town, she found herself studying the back of his head and shoulders, wondering what strange impulse had moved him to rescue a stranger from what could have been a very dangerous situation. In her experience, such spontaneous generosity usually came with strings attached, expectations that were not always stated clearly at the outset. Yet something about his manner suggested that his offer was genuine, motivated by nothing more complicated than basic human decency, and perhaps a touch of that noblesse oblige that supposedly characterized the better sort of wealthy person. The town of Menard proved to be larger than she had expected, with well-maintained streets and prosperous-looking businesses that spoke of a thriving community. Alexander guided his horse with easy confidence through the residential section, finally stopping before a neat white house with a welcoming glow of lamplight in the windows and smoke rising steadily from the chimney. "Mrs. Henderson," he called as he dismounted and then turned to assist Evangeline. "I have brought you a visitor who is in need of your hospitality." The front door opened to reveal a plump, middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes who took in the situation with a sort of quick assessment that suggested considerable experience with unexpected guests. "Alexander Whitmore, what have you been up to now? And who is this young lady you have brought to my doorstep?" "Mrs. Henderson, may I present Miss Evangeline Washington. She has been stranded by the train delay and has accepted my invitation to stay at the ranch until Thursday. I thought you might enjoy her company while I conduct my business with the banker." Mrs. Henderson's gaze sharpened as she took in Evangeline's appearance and circumstances, but her expression remained warmly welcoming. "Of course, dear. Come in out of the cold at once. Alexander, you may fetch her in 2 hours' time, and not a moment sooner. Miss Washington and I have much to discuss, I am certain." As Evangeline found herself ushered into the warm, lamplit parlor, she caught Alexander's small smile at Mrs. Henderson's proprietary tone. Clearly, this was a woman accustomed to managing the social arrangements of her community, and just as clearly, Alexander was comfortable deferring to her authority in such matters. "I shall return promptly at the appointed time," he assured them both, tipping his hat once more before taking his leave. Mrs. Henderson waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded before turning to Evangeline with frank curiosity. "Now then, my dear, let us have some tea, and you can tell me how you come to be traveling alone to Denver in the middle of winter. Alexander may be satisfied with the bare facts of your situation, but I confess I am possessed of a more inquiring nature. As Evangeline settled into a comfortable chair beside the fire and accepted a cup of blessedly hot tea, she reflected that perhaps her luck was finally beginning to change. For the first time in days, she was warm, she was welcome, and she was in the company of people who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. It was enough to make her almost believe that her journey west might yet prove to have been a wise decision. The next 2 hours passed more pleasantly than any Evangeline could remember in recent months. Mrs. Henderson proved to be exactly the sort of woman her initial impression had suggested. Warmly maternal, endlessly curious about people and their stories, and possessed of a remarkable ability to put strangers at their ease. Under her gentle but persistent questioning, Evangeline found herself sharing more of her history than she had intended. She spoke of her childhood in Virginia, where she had been born into slavery on a plantation that had prided itself on treating its human property with relative kindness, a phrase that had always struck her as revealing far more about the speakers than they perhaps intended. She described her education, obtained through the persistence of a plantation owner's daughter who had defied convention by teaching several of the slave children to read and write, believing it her Christian duty to prepare them for eventual freedom. "A wise young woman," Mrs. Henderson commented, refilling Evangeline's teacup. "Education is the one thing that can never be taken from you, no matter what else you may lose." Evangeline nodded, thinking of the precious books wrapped carefully in her traveling bag, the volumes of poetry and philosophy that had sustained her through the difficult years of transition from slavery to freedom. Miss Catherine believed that knowledge was the greatest gift she could give us. She was perhaps more right than she knew. She went on to describe the confusion and uncertainty that had followed emancipation, when freedom had proven to be a more complicated condition than any of them had anticipated. Without the questionable security of their former status, many of the freed slaves had found themselves worse off than before, struggling to find work, housing, and basic sustenance in a world that viewed them with suspicion and hostility. "I was fortunate," Evangeline said, stirring honey into her second cup of tea. "Miss Catherine's family had connections in St. Louis, and they helped me find employment with a dressmaking establishment. The work was skilled and respectable, and I was able to save money over several years." "But you decided to leave," Mrs. Henderson observed. "What called you to Colorado?" This was more difficult to explain, involving as it did not just practical considerations but a deep longing for something she could barely articulate. "I had a letter from a friend who had traveled west. She wrote of opportunities for women willing to work hard, of communities where a person might be judged more by their character than their ancestry. It seemed hopeful." Mrs. Henderson's expression grew thoughtful. "And yet you find yourself stranded in a place where such judgment seems to be in rather short supply." "Perhaps I was naive to expect otherwise," Evangeline admitted. "But the alternative was to remain in circumstances that offered little hope of advancement or change. Sometimes the uncertain path is preferable to the certain dead end." "A philosophy that requires considerable courage to implement," Mrs. Henderson said approvingly. "I think you will find that Alexander's family shares your belief in judging people by their character rather than their circumstances. The Whitmores have always been rather unconventional in their views, much to the occasional consternation of their more traditional neighbors." Before Evangeline could ask what she meant by this intriguing comment, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Alexander's return. Mrs. Henderson rose to answer his knock, and Evangeline heard them speaking in low voices on the front porch before he entered the parlor. "I trust Mrs. Henderson has been taking proper care of you," he said, his gaze taking in her improved appearance with apparent satisfaction. The warmth of the house and the ministrations of her hostess had indeed worked their magic. Her color had returned, her clothing had dried, and she looked considerably less like a refugee from circumstance than she had 2 hours earlier. "She has been kindness itself," Evangeline replied truthfully. "I am deeply grateful for her hospitality." "As am I," Alexander said, turning to Mrs. Henderson. "I hope you will forgive me for imposing upon your generosity with so little notice." "Nonsense. It has been a pleasure to have such agreeable company. Miss Washington, you must promise to call upon me when you return from Denver. I shall be most interested to hear of your adventures." The casual assumption that she would return, that her journey would be successful enough to permit social calls, touched Evangeline unexpectedly. It had been so long since anyone had expressed confidence in her future that she had almost forgotten how encouraging such faith could be. "I would be honored, Mrs. Henderson." The ride to the W Ranch proved to be a revelation in itself. Even in the darkness, Evangeline could sense the vastness of the landscape around them, the rolling hills and distant mountains that spoke of a land too large to be easily comprehended. Alexander proved to be an informative guide, pointing out landmarks and explaining the geography of the region with the obvious pride of a man deeply attached to his home. "The ranch has been in my family for nearly 20 years, he explained as they rode through an impressive stone gateway marked with an ornate W. "My father came west after the war, seeking opportunities for investment and expansion. He found both, along with something he had not expected to find. Which was a place where a man might build something entirely his own, where the constraints of Eastern society need not apply. He used to say that the West was God's way of giving Americans a second chance to get things right." As they approached the ranch house, Evangeline caught her breath in surprise. She had expected something rustic, perhaps even primitive, but the building that came into view was a substantial two-story structure that would not have looked out of place in the better neighborhoods of St. Louis. Warm light glowed from numerous windows, and the overall effect was one of gracious prosperity rather than frontier austerity. "My father believed that civilization should advance with settlement," Alexander said, noting her surprise. "He saw no reason why comfort and refinement should be sacrificed merely because one chose to live at some distance from established cities." A stable boy appeared to take charge of the horse, greeting Alexander with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. As they approached the front door, it opened to reveal a tall, elegant woman who could only be the aunt Alexander had mentioned. She appeared to be in her 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair, arranged in a sophisticated style and clothing that spoke of both quality and understated taste. "Alexander, there you are at last. We have been quite concerned about your delayed return." Her gaze moved to Evangeline with frank curiosity but no apparent disapproval. "And this must be our unexpected guest. Aunt Cordelia, may I present Miss Evangeline Washington?" "Miss Washington, my aunt, Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore." The introduction was performed with the same easy courtesy Alexander had shown throughout the evening, as if bringing home stranded travelers was a perfectly ordinary occurrence. Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward with a welcoming smile that seemed entirely genuine. "Miss Washington, how delightful to have a visitor. I do hope you will forgive the informal nature of our invitation, but Alexander has always been somewhat impulsive when it comes to extending hospitality." "Mrs. Whitmore, I cannot adequately express my gratitude for your kindness. I hope my presence will not cause inconvenience to your household. On the contrary, we are delighted to have you. It has been far too long since we have had the pleasure of a guest. Alexander, I have had Mary prepare the blue room, and cook has kept dinner warm. I thought Miss Washington might appreciate a hot meal after her ordeal." As they entered the house, Evangeline found herself in a spacious foyer with polished hardwood floors and furnishings that would have been at home in any fashionable Eastern residence. A wide staircase curved gracefully to the second floor, and through an open doorway she could see into a parlor appointed with obvious care and considerable expense. "How lovely your home is," she said, meaning it sincerely. "Thank you, my dear. My late husband had quite definite ideas about how a house should be furnished, and I confess I have maintained his standards. He believed that one's surroundings had a considerable influence on one's state of mind, and I have found his philosophy to be sound." A young woman appeared at the top of the stairs, and Alexander's face brightened noticeably. "Sophia, come down and meet our guest. Miss Washington, my sister, Miss Sophia Whitmore." The young woman who descended the stairs was perhaps 18 or 19, with the same light brown hair as her brother and an open, friendly countenance that suggested a naturally sunny disposition. She was dressed simply but elegantly in a blue wool dress that complemented her coloring admirably. "Miss Washington, how exciting to have a visitor. Alexander told us about your situation, and I am so glad he thought to invite you to stay with us. I hope you will not find our company too dull after the sophistication of city life." The warmth of her welcome, the obvious sincerity of the entire family's reception, left Evangeline feeling somewhat overwhelmed. She had steeled herself for barely concealed hostility, grudging tolerance at best, and instead found herself surrounded by people who seemed genuinely pleased by her presence. "I fear it is I who will prove poor company," she replied. "I am not accustomed to such gracious hospitality." "Then we shall have to accustom you to it," Mrs. Whitmore said firmly. "Now, let us not stand about in the foyer when there is a perfectly good dining room waiting. Alexander, you may wash and join us in 10 minutes. Miss Washington, Sophia will show you to your room so that you may refresh yourself before dinner." As Evangeline followed Sophia up the elegant staircase, she reflected that perhaps Mrs. Henderson had been right about the Whitmore family's unconventional views. In her experience, families of their obvious social standing did not typically welcome unknown strangers with such genuine warmth, particularly when those strangers brought with them the potential for social complications. The Blue Room proved to be charming and comfortable, with a large four-poster bed, a cozy sitting area by the window, and a washstand appointed with fine china and soft towels. Someone had already placed her modest traveling bag on a chair and laid out fresh linens. "I hope you will be comfortable here," Sophia said, settling herself in one of the chairs with the easy familiarity of a frequent visitor. "This is my favorite guest room. The morning light is particularly lovely, and you can see all the way to the mountains on a clear day. It is beautiful. Your family has been more than kind." Sophia studied her with frank curiosity. "Alexander said you are traveling to Denver to seek employment. What sort of work do you do?" "I am skilled in dressmaking and design. I had hoped to find a position with an establishment there, or perhaps eventually to set up my own business." "How exciting! I have always thought it would be wonderful to have a profession of one's own. Aunt Cordelia says such ideas are unseemly for a lady, but I cannot see why women should not be allowed to use their talents in whatever way seems best to them." The observation was delivered with the passionate conviction of youth, and Evangeline found herself smiling at the girl's earnestness. "Your aunt may have a point about the challenges such a choice can present. Society does not always look kindly upon women who seek independence." "Then perhaps it is time for society to change its views," Sophia said with spirit. "After all, if we do not challenge expectations, how can we ever hope to improve our circumstances?" It was a sentiment that Evangeline herself had wrestled with many times, and she was struck by the fact that this privileged young woman seemed to understand something about the desire for self-determination that many people never grasped. Perhaps there was more to the Whitmore family's unconventional reputation than simple hospitality towards stranded travelers. A soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation, and Mrs. Whitmore appeared to announce that dinner was ready. As they made their way downstairs, Evangeline reflected that whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she was warm, safe, and among people who seemed genuinely pleased by her company. After the uncertainties and disappointments of the past few days, it felt like an unexpected gift. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, with a sort of brilliant mountain sunshine that made even the coldest air seem invigorating rather than harsh. Evangeline woke to find herself in the most comfortable bed she had slept in for months, surrounded by luxury she had almost forgotten existed. For a moment, she lay still, watching the play of light on the ceiling and marveling at the turn her circumstances had taken in the space of a single evening. A soft knock on the door brought her fully awake, and Sophia's voice called cheerfully, "Miss Washington, are you awake? Aunt Cordelia sent me to tell you that breakfast will be ready in half an hour, but there is no hurry if you prefer to rest longer." "I am awake, thank you," Evangeline called back, already rising and reaching for her traveling dress. It was the only proper dress she had brought, and while it was well made and becoming, she was acutely aware that wearing the same garment day after day would quickly become obvious to her observant hostesses. When she appeared in the dining room 20 minutes later, she found the family already gathered around a table that would have been impressive in any Eastern household. Alexander rose immediately upon her entrance, as did a man she had not met the previous evening, a gentleman of perhaps 45 with graying temples and the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. "Miss Washington," Alexander said warmly. "May I present my ranch foreman, Mr. Thomas Carlyle." "Thomas, Miss Evangeline Washington, our guest until Thursday." Mr. Carlyle bowed politely, his manner respectful but reserved. "Miss Washington, welcome to the Double W. I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you, Mr. Carlyle. Mrs. Whitmore's hospitality has been exemplary." As they settled around the table, Evangeline noticed that the service and appointments were as fine as anything she had encountered in the better establishments of St. Louis. The china was delicate and clearly expensive, the silver bore the patina of quality, and the food that appeared, fresh eggs, perfectly cooked bacon, warm biscuits with honey and preserves, spoke of a kitchen staff that took considerable pride in their work. "I hope you will forgive our informal breakfast arrangements," Mrs. Whitmore said as she poured coffee from an elegant silver pot. "We tend to be rather casual about morning meals, especially when the men have work that requires an early start." "This is hardly what I would call informal," Evangeline replied, accepting her cup with gratitude. The coffee was excellent, rich and smooth in a way that suggested both quality beans and skilled preparation. "Wait until you see how we manage when we have formal company," Sophia said with a laugh. "Aunt Cordelia becomes quite tyrannical about proper service and protocol." "I prefer to think of it as maintaining standards," Mrs. Whitmore said with dignity, though her eyes twinkled with amusement. "Civilization must be preserved, even in the wilderness." "Especially in the wilderness," Alexander added. "It would be all too easy to slip into barbarism if one did not make a conscious effort to maintain the refinements of proper society." The conversation that followed revealed much about the family dynamics and philosophy that governed the Double W Ranch. Alexander and his father had clearly shared a vision of bringing Eastern sophistication to the Western frontier, creating an establishment that combined the opportunities of new territory with the comforts and standards of established civilization. Mrs. Whitmore, as the widow of Alexander's uncle, had taken on the role of social arbiter and household manager with obvious relish and considerable skill. "Tell me, Miss Washington," Mr. Carlyle said as they finished the main course, "what are your impressions of our part of the country? I understand this is your first journey into Colorado territory." "It is more beautiful than I had expected," she replied honestly, "and more developed. I confess I had anticipated something more primitive." "A common misconception," Alexander said, leaning back in his chair with obvious satisfaction. "Too many people in the East persist in thinking of the West as an untamed wilderness populated entirely by savages and desperados. While there are certainly challenges and dangers, there are also opportunities for those with vision and determination to create something truly remarkable." "Alexander has very definite opinions about the potential of this region," Mrs. Whitmore said with fond amusement. "He inherited his father's conviction that Colorado will someday rival any eastern state for prosperity and refinement." "I believe it will surpass them," Alexander said firmly. "We have the advantage of learning from their mistakes, of building something new rather than being constrained by outdated traditions and prejudices." Evangeline found herself wondering if his comment about outdated prejudices was intended as a reference to her own situation, or if it was merely a general observation about social progress. Either way, his obvious conviction that society could and should evolve beyond its current limitations was both encouraging and somewhat surprising coming from a man of his obvious privilege. After breakfast, Mrs. Whitmore insisted on showing Evangeline around the house, pointing out various improvements and refinements with the pride of someone who had invested considerable time and energy in creating a comfortable home. The tour revealed a residence that was not merely well-appointed but thoughtfully designed, with attention to both aesthetic appeal and practical comfort. The late Mr. Whitmore believed that one's environment had a profound influence on one's character and happiness, Mrs. Whitmore explained as they admired the library, a spacious room lined with well-stocked bookshelves and furnished with comfortable reading chairs. He felt that surrounding oneself with beauty and refinement naturally elevated one's thoughts and aspirations. "It is a philosophy I find very appealing," Evangeline said, running her fingers along the spine of a leather-bound volume of poetry. I have always believed that education and cultural refinement were among the greatest gifts one could possess. Precisely. Far too many people seem to think that because we live on a ranch in Colorado Territory, we must necessarily abandon all pretense to civilization. We have worked very hard to prove that assumption false. Their conversation was interrupted by Sophia, who appeared in the library doorway with obvious excitement. Miss Washington, would you like to see the stables? Alexander is showing off his new horse, and I thought you might enjoy meeting Thunder properly in daylight. The prospect of fresh air and activity after the confinement of travel was appealing, and Evangeline readily agreed. As they made their way toward the stables, Sophia chattered enthusiastically about the various animals, clearly sharing her brother's passion for fine horseflesh. Alexander has a particular talent for selecting exceptional horses, she explained as they approached the stable complex, which proved to be as impressive as the main house. He says that in this country, a man's life may depend on the quality of his mount, so it is no place for false economy. The stables were indeed magnificent, constructed of sturdy timber and stone with obvious attention to both function and appearance. Inside, the stalls were spacious and immaculately maintained, housing a collection of horses that would have been impressive in any setting. Alexander was in the central aisle, grooming a magnificent bay stallion that danced restively under his ministrations. "Good morning again, Miss Washington," he called, not pausing in his work. "I trust Sophia is providing an adequate tour of our establishment?" "Very adequate, thank you. Your horses are beautiful." "This is Thunder," Sophia said, approaching the stallion with obvious familiarity. "He is Alexander's favorite, though he would never admit to such favoritism." The horse was indeed magnificent, with the deep chest and powerful hindquarters that spoke of both speed and endurance. As Alexander worked, Evangeline found herself watching his hands as they moved over the animal's coat with practiced competence. There was something unexpectedly appealing about the combination of refinement and capability he represented, a man equally at home in an elegant drawing room or a working stable. "Do you ride, Miss Washington?" Alexander asked, apparently noticing her interest. "I have had some experience, though it has been some time since I had the opportunity." This was a considerable understatement. She had learned to ride as a child on the Virginia plantation, and had been quite accomplished before circumstances had removed such pleasures from her life. "Perhaps you would enjoy a tour of the ranch this afternoon," he suggested, his tone carefully casual. "The weather is fine, and I believe you would find the landscape interesting." The invitation was clearly improper by conventional standards, a single woman riding alone with a single man, particularly when that woman was a guest dependent upon his family's hospitality. Yet there was something in his manner that suggested the offer was motivated by genuine courtesy rather than any less honorable intention. "I would not wish to impose upon your time," she said carefully. "It would be no imposition. I make a circuit of the property several times each week as a matter of course. Your company would make the journey more pleasant rather than less so." Before she could respond, a commotion from the direction of the main house drew their attention. A rider was approaching at considerable speed, and even at a distance, something about his urgency suggested that his news was not entirely welcome. "That's young Miller from the Pogue Ranch," Alexander said, his expression growing serious. "He would not ride so hard unless there was some difficulty." The young man, he could not have been more than 16, pulled his lathered horse to a halt near the stable entrance and dismounted with obvious agitation. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, my father sent me to ask if you could come right away. We have had trouble with some of the hands, and he says you are the only one who might be able to help sort it out." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "What sort of trouble, Jimmy?" "Some of the new men have been causing difficulties, drinking too much, bothering the women in town, making threats when anyone tries to reason with them. Yesterday they got into a fight with some of the railroad workers, and things turned ugly. The sheriff says he cannot do much without more evidence, but father thinks it may get worse before it gets better." Evangeline watched Alexander's face as he processed this information, noting the way his expression shifted from concern to determination. Clearly, This was not an unusual request. Neighboring ranchers turned to him for assistance with problems that required both authority and diplomacy. "Tell your father I will be there within the hour," he said finally. "And Jimmy, ride more carefully on your way home. A lame horse will not improve anyone's situation." As the young man departed with promises to relay the message, Alexander turned to Evangeline with obvious regret. "I am afraid our tour of the ranch will have to be postponed. This situation requires immediate attention." "Of course. I hope you are able to resolve the difficulty." "As do I." He paused, seeming to consider something. "Miss Washington, I should perhaps mention that these sorts of incidents are not uncommon in a region where men often arrive with little more than the clothes on their backs and few prospects for legitimate employment. Most are honest enough, but some find the temptation of easy money through intimidation or worse to be irresistible." She understood the implicit warning, that the area, for all its beauty and opportunity, was not without dangers for those who found themselves vulnerable. It was a reminder that her own situation, while temporarily resolved, remained precarious. "I appreciate the warning, sir. I shall be careful to remain close to the house while you are away. Sophia and Aunt Cordelia will take excellent care of you. And Thomas will remain here to oversee the ranch operations, so you need have no concerns about your safety." The concern in his voice was unmistakable, and Evangeline found herself oddly touched by his obvious worry for her welfare. It had been so long since anyone had felt responsible for her safety that she had almost forgotten how comforting such protection could feel. After Alexander's departure, the ranch seemed quieter, as if his dynamic presence had been a source of energy that was now temporarily absent. Evangeline spent the morning with Mrs. Whitmore, who had indeed found a considerable pile of mending that needed attention. Working with her needle again, creating order from chaos, provided a welcome sense of purpose and familiarity. "You have excellent skills," Mrs. Whitmore observed, watching Evangeline repair a torn seam with tiny, precise stitches. "This work is as fine as anything we could have done in Boston." "Thank you. I have always enjoyed needlework. There is something satisfying about taking something damaged and making it beautiful again." "Indeed. I often think that such skills are more valuable than many people realize. The ability to create beauty and order with one's own hands is not to be underestimated." As they worked, Mrs. Whitmore shared stories about the early days of the ranch, when luxuries had been scarce and every comfort had required considerable ingenuity and effort to achieve. Her descriptions painted a picture of a family that had faced significant challenges with determination and grace, never allowing circumstances to diminish their standards or aspirations. Alexander's father was convinced that the key to successful settlement was to never compromise on the things that truly mattered, she said, threading a needle with silver silk. He believed that if one maintained proper standards of behavior and refinement, prosperity and respect would naturally follow. "It seems his philosophy has proven correct," Evangeline observed, gesturing toward the elegant room around them. "In many ways, yes. Though I sometimes wonder if Alexander feels the burden of maintaining those standards more heavily than his father intended. He can be quite serious about his responsibilities, sometimes to the exclusion of his own happiness." There was something in her tone that suggested this observation was not entirely casual, and Evangeline wondered if Mrs. Whitmore was concerned about Alexander's personal life in some specific way. Before she could consider the matter further, Sophia appeared with the announcement that lunch was ready. The afternoon passed pleasantly enough, with Sophia providing an enthusiastic tour of the flower gardens and conservatory, areas of the ranch that clearly benefited from considerable attention and expense. As they walked among the carefully tended roses and exotic plants, Sophia's conversation revealed both her genuine love for beautiful things and her sometimes rebellious attitude toward the constraints of conventional feminine behavior. "Aunt Cordelia believes that a lady should confine her interests to suitable accomplishments. Music, drawing, perhaps a little light reading," Sophia said, deadheading roses with practiced efficiency. "But I cannot see why a woman's mind should be considered inferior to a man's, or why we should be discouraged from pursuing knowledge and achievement simply because we are women." "Your views are quite progressive," Evangeline said carefully, recognizing the passionate conviction of youth but also the very real social restrictions that made such attitudes difficult to implement. Alexander encourages my education and independent thinking, Sophia continued. He says that intelligence is a gift from God and should be cultivated regardless of one's gender or station in life. I think that is one reason why he remains unmarried, despite considerable pressure from Aunt Cordelia to settle down with a suitable wife. This casual revelation caught Evangeline's attention, though she tried not to show undue interest. I imagine a man in his position would have many opportunities to marry advantageously. Oh, he does. We have been visited by a succession of suitable young ladies, daughters of wealthy families who would bring excellent connections and proper breeding to the match. But Alexander seems to find them all rather tedious. He says he has no interest in marrying a woman who has been trained to be decorative rather than interesting. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, and Sophia's face brightened immediately. Alexander is returning. I hope that means the difficulties at the Pogranch have been resolved satisfactorily. As they made their way back toward the house, Evangeline found herself surprisingly eager to see Alexander again, to learn whether his mission had been successful and to simply enjoy his company once more. The realization that she was beginning to look forward to his presence with more enthusiasm than was entirely proper gave her pause. She was a guest in this house, dependent upon the family's hospitality and goodwill, and it would be both inappropriate and potentially disastrous to develop romantic feelings for her host. Yet as Alexander dismounted near the front porch and turned to greet them with his characteristic warm smile, she could not deny the small thrill of pleasure his return brought her. He looked tired but satisfied, suggesting that whatever crisis had called him away had been successfully resolved. "Ladies, I hope you have had a pleasant afternoon in my absence," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "I bring good news. The situation has been settled without violence, and I believe the troublemakers have been persuaded to seek employment elsewhere." "How did you manage it?" Sophia asked eagerly. Jimmy Miller made it sound quite serious. "Sometimes the threat of consequences is more effective than actual confrontation," Alexander replied diplomatically. The men in question were informed that their behavior was unacceptable to the community and that continued employment in the area was contingent upon significant improvements in their conduct. Most chose to move on rather than reform. And the others will be carefully watched. If they prove willing to behave as civilized men, they will be given the opportunity to do so. If not, he shrugged, leaving the alternative unstated but clearly understood. As they entered the house together, Evangeline reflected that Alexander's approach to the problem revealed something important about his character. Rather than resorting immediately to force or intimidation, he had apparently found a way to resolve the crisis that preserved both peace and dignity for all concerned. It was the approach of a man accustomed to leadership and confident in his ability to find solutions that others might miss. During dinner that evening, the conversation turned to plans for the following day. Mrs. Whitmore mentioned several social obligations that would keep her and Sophia occupied, while Alexander spoke of ranch business that required his attention. It occurred to Evangeline that she might find herself somewhat at loose ends, with little to contribute to the household beyond the mending she had already completed. "Perhaps," she ventured, "I might be of some assistance with other household tasks? I am experienced in kitchen work and general housekeeping, and I would prefer to be useful rather than merely decorative." "That is very thoughtful," Mrs. Whitmore said, "but you are our guest, not our employee. We would not dream of putting you to work. With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, I would feel more comfortable contributing something meaningful to the household. Surely there must be some task that would benefit from an additional pair of hands." Alexander had been listening to this exchange with obvious interest, and now he leaned forward with what appeared to be inspiration. "Actually, there is something that might appeal to your particular skills. We have been discussing the need for new curtains in several of the guest rooms, and possibly some reupholstering of furniture that has seen better days. If you would be interested in consulting on such projects, your expertise would be most welcome." The suggestion was clearly intended to provide her with meaningful work while maintaining the fiction that she was acting as a consultant rather than an employee. It was a tactful solution that preserved her dignity while addressing her desire to contribute something of value to the household. "I would be delighted to help with such projects," she said gratefully. "It would be a pleasure to work with such beautiful materials and furnishings." "Excellent. Tomorrow morning, if you are agreeable, we could examine the rooms in question and discuss what might be most beneficial. I believe you will find our stores of fabric and supplies quite adequate for whatever projects we might undertake." As the evening progressed and the family retired to the parlor for coffee and conversation, Evangeline found herself increasingly aware of the easy intimacy that characterized the Whitmore household. There was genuine affection among the family members, respect for each other's opinions and interests, and a warmth that spoke of deep bonds and shared values. It was the sort of family environment she had always imagined but never experienced, and she could not help but feel a pang of longing for what it would be like to truly belong to such a circle. Alexander, she noticed, seemed to be watching her with particular attention, as if trying to gauge her reactions to his family and their way of life. When their eyes met across the room, she felt that same small thrill of awareness that had become increasingly difficult to ignore. There was something in his gaze that suggested his interest in her went beyond mere politeness or Christian charity, something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch slightly. When Mrs. Whitmore announced that it was time to retire for the evening, Evangeline felt an unexpected reluctance to end what had been one of the most pleasant days she could remember in recent months. As she bid the family good night and made her way upstairs to her comfortable room, she reflected that the next day would be her last full day at the ranch. On Thursday morning, Alexander would escort her back to the train station, and she would continue her journey to Denver and whatever future awaited her there. The thought of leaving filled her with an unexpected sadness that had nothing to do with practical concerns about her destination, and everything to do with the prospect of saying goodbye to people who had shown her such unexpected kindness. And if she were entirely honest with herself, it had particularly to do with saying goodbye to Alexander, whose company had become far more important to her peace of mind than was entirely wise or appropriate. As she prepared for bed in the elegant blue room, Evangeline forced herself to confront the truth she had been avoiding all day. She was developing feelings for Alexander Whitmore that went far beyond gratitude for his assistance or appreciation for his courtesy. Despite every rational argument she could make about the impossibility of such an attachment, despite every practical consideration that argued against allowing herself to care for a man so far above her station, she could not deny that her heart was becoming engaged in a way that could only lead to pain. Tomorrow, she promised herself, she would begin the process of emotional withdrawal that would make Thursday's departure bearable. She would focus on the practical aspects of her continuing journey, on the opportunities that might await her in Denver, on anything except the growing certainty that leaving the W Ranch would feel very much like leaving home. Wednesday morning arrived with a peculiar bittersweetness that Evangeline had not anticipated. As she dressed in her traveling costume, the same garment she had worn upon arrival, but now refreshed and carefully pressed by the ranch's capable staff, she felt the weight of impending departure settling over her like a heavy cloak. Today would be her final full day at the W Ranch, and tomorrow she would return to the uncertainties of travel and the unknown prospects that awaited her in Denver. When she descended to breakfast, she found Alexander already seated at the table, but there was something different about his demeanor this morning. Where previous days had found him relaxed and conversational, today he seemed preoccupied, almost troubled. He rose politely at her entrance and held her chair, but his usual warm greeting was replaced by a more formal acknowledgement of her presence. "Good morning, Miss Washington. I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you, Mr. Whitmore." She found herself matching his suddenly formal tone, though she could not understand what had prompted the change. "I hope the day finds you in good health?" "Quite well, thank you." Mrs. Whitmore and Sophia seemed to sense the alteration in atmosphere as well, for their usual cheerful morning chatter was subdued, replaced by the sort of careful conversation that suggested everyone was thinking about something they preferred not to discuss directly. It was not until they had nearly finished eating that Mrs. Whitmore cleared her throat with the decisive air of someone who had reached an important decision. "Alexander, I believe it is time we discussed the elephant in the parlor, as it were." Alexander's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, and Evangeline noticed his knuckles whiten slightly as his grip tightened. "I am not certain I understand your meaning," Aunt Cordelia. I think you understand perfectly well. We have all become quite fond of Miss Washington during her stay with us, and I believe the feeling is mutual. The question that must be addressed is what, if anything, is to be done about this development. The directness of the statement left Evangeline momentarily speechless. She had thought her growing attachment to the family, and to Alexander in particular, had been carefully concealed, but apparently Mrs. Whitmore's powers of observation were more acute than she had realized. Aunt Cordelia, Alexander said quietly, this is hardly an appropriate topic for breakfast conversation. On the contrary, I believe it is exactly the appropriate time and place. Miss Washington departs tomorrow morning, and if there are things that need to be said, they should be said now, while there is still time to consider alternatives. Sophia looked from her brother to Evangeline with bright, curious eyes, clearly fascinated by this unexpected development. Are you saying that Alexander has formed an attachment to Miss Washington? I am saying, Mrs. Whitmore replied with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child, that anyone with eyes can see that both your brother and our guest have developed feelings that extend beyond the bounds of casual hospitality and gratitude. Evangeline felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could attempt to deny the charge or excuse herself from what was clearly going to be an uncomfortable conversation, Alexander spoke with quiet firmness. Even if what you suggest were true, Aunt Cordelia, it would hardly matter. Miss Washington has her own plans and destinations, and I have responsibilities here that cannot be abandoned on a whim. Responsibilities, yes, Mrs. Whitmore agreed, but not insurmountable obstacles, unless one chooses to view them as such. The conversation was moving into territory that made Evangeline increasingly uncomfortable. While she could not deny the accuracy of Mrs. Whitmore's observations about her feelings, the public discussion of such private matters felt both presumptuous and potentially dangerous. If Alexander did harbor some affection for her, and she hardly dared hope that such a thing was possible, then giving voice to it would only make their inevitable separation more painful. Mrs. Whitmore, she said carefully, while I am deeply grateful for your family's concern for my welfare, I think perhaps this conversation assumes circumstances that do not exist. I am a woman traveling alone with limited resources and uncertain prospects. Mr. Whitmore is a gentleman of property and social standing with obligations to his family and community. Any suggestion that there might be understanding between us is both unrealistic and potentially harmful to his reputation. Hang my reputation, Alexander said with sudden heat, startling everyone at the table with the vehemence of his response. I am tired of having every aspect of my life governed by what other people might think or say. The outburst revealed a depth of frustration that Evangeline had not suspected, and she found herself wondering how long he had been struggling with feelings he felt unable to express. Mrs. Whitmore, however, seemed unsurprised by his reaction, suggesting that this was not the first time such tensions had come to the surface. Then perhaps, she said mildly, it is time to stop allowing other people's opinions to dictate your choices. It is not that simple, and you know it. There are practical considerations. Such as the fact that I have no right to ask any woman to share the uncertainties and potential difficulties that such a choice would entail. Miss Washington deserves better than to be subjected to the sort of social ostracism and practical complications that would inevitably result from an association with me. Evangeline stared at him, trying to process the implications of what he had just said. Was he suggesting that he had indeed developed feelings for her, but was rejecting the possibility of acting upon them out of concern for her welfare? The idea was both thrilling and heartbreaking. Thrilling because it suggested that her own growing attachment was reciprocated, heartbreaking because he was essentially declaring such feelings to be hopeless. Alexander, she said softly, you speak as if I have no voice in such decisions, as if I am incapable of weighing the potential costs and benefits of my own choices. He turned to look at her directly for the first time that morning, and she saw in his eyes a combination of longing and resignation that made her heart ache. What I am saying, Miss Washington, is that I have no right to ask you to sacrifice your future for the sake of feelings that society will never accept or approve. And what I am saying, Mr. Whitmore, is that perhaps the decision of what constitutes a sacrifice should be left to me. The words hung in the air between them, charged with possibilities that neither had dared voice before this moment. Evangeline could hardly believe she had spoken so boldly, but something about the morning's conversation had removed the careful politeness that had governed their interactions, leaving only raw honesty in its place. Sophia clapped her hands together with delight. "Oh, this is better than any novel. Alexander, surely you cannot be so obtuse as to miss what Miss Washington is trying to tell you." "Sophia," Mrs. Whitmore said mildly, "perhaps you could find something to occupy yourself elsewhere for a few minutes. I believe your brother and Miss Washington need to continue this conversation with somewhat more privacy." As Sophia departed with obvious reluctance, Mrs. Whitmore rose from her own chair. "I shall be in the morning room if you need me. Alexander, I suggest you remember that sometimes the greatest risk is in not taking any risk at all." When they were finally alone, Alexander and Evangeline sat in silence for several long moments, neither seeming to know how to begin a conversation that had already moved far beyond the bounds of conventional propriety. Finally, Alexander pushed back his chair and moved to the window, staring out at the mountain landscape with his hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Washington, Evangeline, I owe you an apology. My family has put you in an impossible position, and I should have prevented such a scene." "Have they?" she asked quietly. "Put me in an impossible position, I mean?" He turned to face her, his expression troubled. "Have they not? You are a guest in our home, dependent upon our hospitality, and now you have been subjected to an interrogation about matters that should remain private." "That is not what I meant." She rose from her own chair and moved closer to him, though she was careful to maintain a proper distance. "I meant, is the position truly impossible, or merely difficult?" "Evangeline." Her name came out as barely more than a whisper, and she could see the struggle in his eyes. "You cannot know what you are asking. I am asking you to give me credit for understanding my own mind and my own heart. I am asking you to stop making decisions for me based on what you think I should want, rather than what I have told you I do want." "And what is it that you want?" The question was asked with such quiet intensity that she felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment of truth, the point at which she could either retreat into safety or risk everything for the possibility of something she had never dared hope for. "I want," she said carefully, "to be valued for who I am rather than dismissed for who I am not. I want to be seen as a woman capable of making her own choices about her own life. And I want—" she paused, gathering her courage. "I want the chance to discover whether the feelings that have developed between us might be the foundation for something lasting and meaningful." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the battle being waged in his expression. Duty against desire, social convention against personal happiness, the safe path against the unknown one. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Do you have any idea what you would be giving up? The kind of life you could have with a man who could offer you social acceptance and financial security without the complications that come with us." "What I would be giving up," she said firmly, "is the chance for a love match with a man I have come to respect and care for deeply. What I would be gaining is a life of safety and comfort with someone I do not love and who does not love me. The choice seems clear enough. It would not be easy. There would be challenges, difficulties, people who would never accept our union. There are challenges and difficulties in any life, Alexander. The question is whether we face them together or separately." He moved closer to her then, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue-green eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Evangeline, I have been fighting these feelings for days, telling myself that it would be madness to fall in love with a woman I met only 3 days ago, a woman whose presence in my life would create complications I cannot even begin to anticipate." "And have you succeeded?" "In fighting these feelings, I mean." "Not even remotely." The admission seemed to break something inside him, and suddenly his hands were framing her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "I have been lost since the moment I saw you on that train platform, since you looked at me with such dignity despite your circumstances, since you accepted my family's hospitality with such grace. I am completely, utterly, hopelessly in love with you." The words hung between them for a heartbeat before he leaned down and captured her lips with his own. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if he were giving her the opportunity to change her mind. But when she responded by rising on her toes and winding her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of all the longing and restraint of the past 3 days. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Evangeline felt as if the world had shifted fundamentally around her. "Alexander," she whispered, "what are we going to do?" "We are going to figure it out together," he said firmly. "Starting with the fact that you are not getting on that train tomorrow morning." "But I have no money for extended accommodations, no employment prospects here." "You have employment prospects," he interrupted. "Mrs. Whitmore mentioned yesterday that she would like to hire a permanent seamstress and companion. The salary would be generous, the accommodations comfortable, and the work well within your capabilities." Evangeline stared at him. "You arranged this?" "Mrs. Whitmore arranged it. I merely mentioned that it would be a tragedy to lose such skilled help when the ranch has need of it." "And if I stay, what then?" "Then we see where this leads us. We take the time to truly know each other, to be certain that what we feel is genuine and lasting. And if it proves to be so," he paused, seeming to gather his courage. "If it proves to be so, then I will ask you to marry me, regardless of what anyone else might think about the matter." The declaration was so matter-of-fact, so confident, that for a moment she could only stare at him. "You would truly be willing to marry me? Knowing the difficulties it would create?" "Evangeline, I would consider myself the most fortunate man in Colorado Territory to have you as my wife. Any difficulties we might face would be insignificant compared to the alternative of living without you." Before she could respond, a commotion in the front hall announced the arrival of visitors. Alexander stepped back reluctantly, though he kept her hand clasped firmly in his. "We should probably make ourselves presentable. It sounds as if we have company." The visitors proved to be Mr. and Mrs. Pogue from the neighboring ranch, accompanied by a young woman Evangeline had not met. Mrs. Whitmore performed the introductions with her usual grace, presenting the newcomer as Miss Charlotte Hartwell, daughter of a prominent Denver banking family who was visiting the Pogues for the winter season. Miss Hartwell was everything that Evangeline was not: fair-haired, fashionably dressed, obviously wealthy, and possessed of the sort of refined prettiness that society deemed appropriate for young ladies of good family. She was also, it became apparent within the first few minutes of conversation, exactly the sort of woman that Mrs. Pogue believed would make an ideal wife for Alexander. "Charlotte has been so looking forward to meeting you, Alexander," Mrs. Pogue gushed. "She has heard so much about your family's success with the ranch, and she is quite interested in the opportunities for investment that Colorado Territory provides." Miss Hartwell smiled prettily and extended her gloved hand to Alexander with practiced grace. "Mr. Whitmore, I am delighted to make your acquaintance. Your reputation for business acumen has reached even Denver society." Alexander accepted her hand politely but without enthusiasm, and Evangeline noticed that he released it as quickly as courtesy would allow. "Miss Hartwell, welcome to the Double W. I trust your visit to our region has been pleasant." "Oh, very much so. Though I confess I am surprised by how civilized everything is. I had expected something much more primitive." The comment, clearly intended as a compliment, revealed exactly the sort of Eastern prejudice about Western life that Alexander had mentioned with obvious irritation on previous occasions. Evangeline saw his jaw tighten slightly, though his expression remained politely neutral. "We work very hard to maintain proper standards," he said diplomatically. "May I present our house guest, Miss Evangeline Washington? She has been staying with us while awaiting the resumption of train service to Denver." The introduction was performed with scrupulous correctness, but Evangeline did not miss the way Miss Hartwell's gaze sharpened as she took in both Evangeline's appearance and the implications of her presence in the Whitmore household. Her smile remained perfectly in place, but there was something calculating in her eyes that suggested she was rapidly reassessing the situation. "How interesting," Miss Hartwell said with honeyed sweetness. "And what takes you to Denver, Miss Washington?" "I am seeking employment opportunities there," Evangeline replied simply, meeting the other woman's gaze directly. "Employment? How enterprising. In what field, if I may ask?" There was something in the way the question was phrased that suggested Miss Hartwell was fishing for information that would allow her to categorize Evangeline in some dismissive way. Before Evangeline could respond, however, Alexander stepped smoothly into the conversation. "Miss Washington is an accomplished seamstress and designer," he said with obvious pride. "Her work is of the highest quality, quite comparable to anything one might find in the finest Eastern establishments." "How fascinating," Miss Hartwell said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "I suppose there is always a demand for skilled domestic help, even in places as remote as this." The casual dismissal was clearly intended to put Evangeline in her place, but before anyone could respond to the slight, Mrs. Whitmore appeared with the announcement that refreshments were ready in the parlor. As they moved toward the sitting room, Evangeline caught Alexander's eye, and saw there a flash of anger that told her Miss Hartwell's condescending comment had not gone unnoticed. The visit that followed was an exercise in social torture for Evangeline. Miss Hartwell, apparently sensing some threat to her potential claim on Alexander's attention, launched into a campaign of subtle but unmistakable efforts to establish her superiority and suitability as a romantic prospect. She spoke knowledgeably about mutual acquaintances in Denver society, referenced her family's extensive business connections, and made frequent allusions to her accomplishments in music, art, and languages. "I have just completed a landscape of the mountain view from the Pogue Ranch," she said, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Whitmore. "Painting has always been such a passion of mine. I find that artistic expression is essential for a woman of refined sensibilities." "How lovely," Mrs. Whitmore replied politely. "We are always appreciative of those who can capture the beauty of our landscape. Of course, I also maintain an extensive correspondence with friends in Boston and New York. It is so important to keep abreast of cultural developments, do you not think? One can become quite provincial if one allows oneself to become too isolated from civilized society." The barb was aimed directly at the Whitmore family's choice to live in Colorado Territory rather than in an established eastern city, and Evangeline saw Alexander's expression grow increasingly cold. Clearly, Miss Hartwell had badly misjudged her audience if she thought criticizing their chosen way of life would endear her to them. "We find," Alexander said with icy politeness, "that civilization is something one creates rather than something one inherits by accident of geography. Character and refinement are portable qualities, while snobbery and small-mindedness seem to flourish equally well in any location." The rebuke was subtle but unmistakable, and Miss Hartwell's cheeks flushed slightly as she realized her comments had not been well received. Mrs. Pogue, sensing the growing tension, attempted to redirect the conversation to safer topics, but the damage had been done. For the remainder of the visit, Alexander's responses were coolly correct but completely lacking in warmth or encouragement. When the visitors finally departed, with Mrs. Pogue issuing invitations for future social gatherings that Alexander accepted with obvious reluctance, the family gathered in the parlor with evident relief. "Well," Sophia said with characteristic directness, "that was thoroughly unpleasant. Miss Hartwell certainly has a high opinion of herself." "Sophia," Mrs. Whitmore chided mildly, "it is not charitable to speak ill of guests." "I am not speaking ill of her," Sophia protested. "I am merely observing that she seems to believe that accident of birth and family connections are adequate substitutes for personal character and genuine accomplishment." "An observation with which I am inclined to agree," Alexander said grimly. "Miss Hartwell may be everything that conventional society considers desirable in a wife, but she is also everything that I find insufferable in a human being." Evangeline had remained silent during this exchange, but now she felt compelled to speak. "You should not dismiss her too quickly because of my presence here. Miss Hartwell represents exactly the sort of advantageous match that families like yours are expected to make." Alexander turned to her with something approaching incredulity. "Evangeline, surely you cannot believe that I would prefer a woman like Charlotte Hartwell to you?" "I believe that Miss Hartwell could offer you social acceptance, business connections, and a wife who would never cause you to question your place in society. These are not insignificant considerations. They are completely insignificant considerations compared to love, respect, and genuine compatibility. Mrs. Whitmore had been watching this exchange with obvious interest, and now she leaned forward with a thoughtful expression. Miss Washington, may I ask what has prompted this sudden attack of practicality? This morning you seemed quite willing to explore the possibilities that Alexander was suggesting. Evangeline struggled to find words for the doubts that Miss Hartwell's visit had awakened. Seeing Alexander in the same room with a woman who represented everything that society expected him to want had forced her to confront the reality of what she would be asking him to sacrifice. This morning I was thinking only of my own feelings, she said finally. But seeing Miss Hartwell, watching the way she interacted with all of you, made me realize what Alexander would be giving up if he chose to, if we decided to. To what? Alexander asked quietly. To build a life together based on mutual love and respect rather than social convention and family expectation? To marry beneath his station, she said bluntly. To choose a wife who will bring him social complications rather than social advantages, who will limit his opportunities rather than expand them. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and for a moment no one spoke. Then Alexander moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in both of his with gentle firmness. Evangeline, look at me. When she reluctantly met his gaze, he continued with quiet intensity. What I would be giving up, if I chose to marry someone like Charlotte Hartwell, is the chance for genuine happiness. What I would be gaining is a life of comfortable misery with a woman I could never love or respect. You speak of marrying beneath my station as if such a thing were possible. But the truth is that any man would be elevated by the privilege of claiming you as his wife. Alexander. No, let me finish. You speak of social complications as if they are insurmountable obstacles, but they are nothing compared to the complication of trying to build a meaningful life with the wrong person. You worry about limiting my opportunities, but you are the greatest opportunity one have ever been offered. The opportunity to love and be loved in return. To build something real and lasting with someone who challenges me to be better than I am. Tears had begun to slide down Evangeline's cheeks, though she was not entirely sure whether they were tears of happiness or heartbreak. You make it sound so simple. It is simple. Not easy, perhaps, but simple. The question is not whether our marriage would create difficulties. It would. The question is whether we love each other enough to face those difficulties together. Whether we believe that what we could build together is worth more than what we might lose separately. Mrs. Whitmore cleared her throat delicately. If I may interject a practical consideration into this romantic discussion, the question of social acceptance may be less problematic than you fear, Miss Washington. Colorado Territory is full of people who came west precisely because they wanted to escape the rigid social constraints of Eastern society. While there will certainly be some who disapprove, there will also be many who judge you by your character rather than your ancestry. And, Sophia added with passionate conviction, if people are small-minded enough to reject you because of prejudice and ignorance, then they are not the sort of people whose opinion should matter to us anyway. Alexander squeezed Evangeline's hands gently. What do you say? Will you trust me when I tell you that loving you is not a sacrifice but a privilege? Will you believe me when I say that any life we build together will be richer and more meaningful than anything I could achieve alone? Looking into his eyes, seeing the love and determination there, Evangeline felt the last of her resistance crumble. Perhaps there would indeed be challenges ahead, difficulties that neither of them could fully anticipate. But the alternative, walking away from the deepest connection she had ever felt, abandoning the possibility of a love that could transform both their lives, suddenly seemed not practical but cowardly. Yes, she whispered, and then more strongly. Yes, Alexander. I will trust you. I will believe you. And I will marry you, if you are certain that is what you want. His answer was to pull her into his arms and kiss her with such thoroughness that any doubts about his certainty were immediately dispelled. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, they found themselves the center of attention from a beaming Mrs. Whitmore and an ecstatic Sophia. "Oh, this is wonderful!" Sophia exclaimed. clapping her hands together. "We shall have a wedding. Aunt Cordelia, we must begin planning immediately. There is so much to do." "Not too immediately," Alexander said with a laugh, though he kept his arms firmly around Evangeline. "We should perhaps allow the bride and groom time to become accustomed to the idea before we begin organizing the ceremony." "Nonsense," Mrs. Whitmore said briskly. "You have been accustomed to the idea since the moment you met, whether you realized it or not. The only question is whether you prefer a small, intimate ceremony or something more elaborate." As the family began an animated discussion of wedding plans, Evangeline found herself marveling at the speed with which her entire life had changed. 3 days ago, she had been a woman alone, facing an uncertain future with limited resources and diminishing hopes. Now she was engaged to a man she loved deeply, surrounded by a family that had welcomed her with open hearts, and contemplating a future that seemed bright with possibility. There would indeed be challenges ahead. She was not naive enough to believe otherwise. There would be people who disapproved of their union, business associates who might question Alexander's judgment, social situations that would test both their resolve and their commitment to each other. But looking around at the warm, welcoming faces of her new family, feeling the strength and steadiness of Alexander's presence beside her, Evangeline found herself confident that whatever difficulties arose, they would face them together. And that, she reflected, made all the difference in the world. She had boarded that train in St. Louis as a woman seeking merely survival and the possibility of modest independence. She would never board the train to Denver at all, because she had found something infinitely more valuable right here at the W Ranch. She had found home and love, and a future that exceeded her wildest dreams. As the afternoon sun slanted through the parlor windows, painting everything in warm golden light, Evangeline smiled and settled more comfortably into Alexander's embrace. Tomorrow the train would come and go without her, carrying other travelers toward their destinations while she remained exactly where she belonged. Sometimes, she thought drowsily, the best journeys were the ones that brought you not to some distant place, but home to the people who were meant to love you. The story that had begun with a stranded woman facing a cold night alone at a train station had become something far more wonderful, a tale of love triumphant, of barriers overcome, and of two hearts finding their perfect match against all odds. And as Mrs. Whitmore began making lists of wedding preparations while Sophia planned the flower arrangements, Evangeline knew with absolute certainty that her real journey was just beginning.